So this is a reminder on Monday, 23 October in CSC 220 Intro to Cyber Security. We have some assignments that are due. Some of you have not yet contacted me to select a time when you would like to access the virtual machine and to request approval for that access, because I'm supposed to role play and stand in as an IT manager, granting you access to physically observe phase one, physical data acquisition, right? So that's just a reminder that you need to have a look at, we'll go ahead and update this, but people need to pick a time and a day so that we can coordinate when students will access the remote system. Once again, the remote system is intended to stand in for a physical office. So when you get permission to access the system, it's as if you're being told to enter a physical office and then to use a temporary password to see about the current activity on that machine. Yes, there was a question.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna ask, could I just do mine on Tuesday? Because I already emailed you, but something came up. So can I
Yes.
just do mine on Tuesday?
Yes, just beam me another email that asks, can I do it on Tuesday at this time?
All right, thank you.
That's the easiest way to handle it. So we'll go ahead and update the days and times for this reference here. So everyone needs to get in here and get started. So without further ado, what we'd like to do is start with our review of the concepts and methods that are covered in the study guide and in the module slides. So we have this study guide on tap. Everybody can see this, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So what we'd like to do is to start looking at our specific learning objectives and then take up from the slides in the references folder, right? So as you begin working in our third module, we want you to be able to discuss or explain the need for formal contingency planning, right? When you have incidents, there are times when, if depending on what presents in the incident, the pattern of events, you'll need to have a contingency about how to respond, especially if there are legal implications, right? We're going to be taking a little more of we're going to revisit risk management by talking about the tools to manage risk effectively. One is called the business impact analysis, and it's the business impact analysis that helps an organization make informed decisions about how to handle incidents and how to recover from disasters and how to continue their business continuity. That's BC, right? So that's what those acronyms stand for: incident handling, disaster recovery, and how do you continue while you're recovering from a disaster? How do you continue your business? Those are two separate but related things. And that's, again, part of a common set of tools to manage the risk in an organization. We want you to be able to identify the initial processes used in digital forensic investigations, and you're actually experiencing that in the solution, right? And then define the components of crisis management. So in a worst case scenario, when an incident becomes a disaster, right, there's an emergency operations center that is formed to manage the crisis. So we'll be talking about worst case scenarios, and then how to prepare, perform, and refine contingency drills. That's for the 5th chapter or module of the textbook. And then in the next chapter or module of the textbook, it gets into the legal aspects, differentiating between law and ethics. We've touched on some of this already. We want you to understand where to go and how to get support from law enforcement agencies, and what the best practices are to respond to an incident, especially when there are legal implications. So planning for unexpected events is usually the responsibility of managers from the information technology and the information security communities of interest. So it's the cybersecurity folks and the tech folks. And in order for a plan to be seen as valid by all members of an organization, it must be sanctioned and actively supported by the general business community of interest. So by the stakeholders in that organization, basically. Some organizations are required by law or other legal statutes, right? Other mandates to have contingency planning procedures in place at all times. Hospitals are a great example where, or certain financial institutions, if bank account data is compromised, credit card account data is compromised, these institutions are required by law to respond and to follow through with certain contingencies and to notify the people whose data was affected, right? So hang on just a moment. I have some folks who are joining this session. Almost there. Good afternoon. Let's look at some of the publisher slides real quick, just to see what the authors have to share about this topic. And in fact, I think what I'm going to do is stick to the previous convention. So we'll actually zip all the way down to the summary, I think. So we'll start with the summary and then take a deeper dive for some of the key points. So we were just saying the managers are involved, right? And some organizations. So what we were just reading in the study guide on that study guide page is quite literally the highlights of the slides, right? So they have to rehearse, detect, react, and recover from events. And if you don't do that, you're not really prepared. So even though some organizations are required by law or other mandates to have contingency planning procedures in place, all business organizations should prepare and they should practice. See, if you don't rehearse and attempt to detect and react to and recover when it hits, it's like, folks, has anyone ever heard of the phrase deer in the headlights?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, when a deer is caught in the headlights of a car at night, they tend to freeze. And against all common sense, they're supposed to get out of the way, but they freeze. That's what a deer in the headlights moment means. So contingency planning is made up of 4 major components, right? So you're gonna collect data and document the aspects of your business that are the most critical. So after you've finished risk management and you've conducted some important reviews for risk management, in order to implement measures to help when something bad happens, you have to use this method known as a business impact analysis. And what that does is it fleshes out when certain systems or data are lost, what's the impact? What's the impact of the business, right? That's what you're anticipating in response. And then you make informed decisions about how to handle that, right? So you have an incident, if it's really bad in particular, right, then you have a way to work the situation. And depending on the situation and the conditions are different, that's called a contingency. Now, in the worst case scenario, when the incident becomes a disaster, you have a plan to recover from the disaster and then a separate plan on how to keep going with your business after the disaster occurs. So here's a quick example I'd like to share with you. Let's pretend that you're part of a restaurant and it's a family-owned business. Is everybody with me there?
Yeah.
Simple scenario. And you have a family restaurant, right? And let's say that you find out that when you look at your family business, 9 out of 10 customers pay with a credit card. Okay? Does that sound like a reasonable scenario?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so 1 out of 10 pay with cash, but 9 out of 10 pay with a credit card, right? And let's say that depending on your family business, if you don't get the receipts from the sales, let's pretend that in your family business, you don't have a lot of reserves. So when it comes to getting food and supplies and materials for the next week of business, you have to have a certain amount of funds, right? You have to have a certain amount of liquidity, right? You have to have some extra in reserve. So part of your incident response plan is to go ahead and keep a certain amount in reserve. And let's pretend that there's a data outage, there's a power outage and then an internet service outage so that your family cannot use the credit cards, okay? So how many customers can't pay? What have we already determined?
90% of them can't use anything.
Yeah, 90% can't, right? So you have to figure out, how do I get my credit card machine back in action? That's the disaster recovery piece, right? And again, this is just a very simple example. So part of my plan or contingency is, okay, somebody's going to be working on getting that credit card back in operation, that credit card machine back in operation. And then what's the other plan? What do you do when people have already eaten your food and they're ready to leave? What do you do? Maybe, what would be a practical thing to do? Well, let's pretend that they need to leave and they present you with a credit card. What is one thing you can do with that credit card so that you can use and enter the information after the service is restored?
You basically like jot down the credit card number on the CVC for later use.
You could jot down the credit card number. You could take a picture of the credit card, right? With their permission. You take a picture of the credit card front and back with their permission, and they sign off on a form. So you have a form. Maybe you have a paper form with some pens, and you say, okay, we're going to take a picture of this so that we can enter the transactions later. And what else do you put on the form? Oh, you know, what the gratuity or tip is, right? What the total is. So the base charge, the tip, and the gratuity. And they note this on the form. They check a box that says, yes, I'm okay if you note the information from my card, provided you will destroy this info, you will shred the form after confirmation of the transaction, right? So you have a form and it's stated simply enough so the customer can look at it and go in 3 sentences, okay, I get what this is for. I understand. Yeah, as long as you shred this form, I'm all right with it, right? So you either note the information or you take a picture and you refer to that on the form. So as soon as you get your information back, you could go and take your credit card machine to another place where there is service, right? Couldn't you? In theory?
Yeah.
Yeah, after the day is done. So that's a simple example of what we're talking about. Only to scale with a larger organization, of course, those components, those methods are more detailed. There's more people involved. There's more documentation, right? So that's the point. We want people to understand risk management is great, but what do you do with it once you understand the risks? Well, it translates to an impact. And you have to look at your business and analyze, okay, if the worst happens here, if the worst happens there, what's the effect? What's my fallback? How do I recover? Until I can recover, how do I keep going? And these are things people just don't take the time to flesh out. Now, here is one thing that I notice in our textbook. They don't call this out. So you'll notice the slides here from the authors and the publisher. I've amended these slides. I've changed these slides, right? There is a thing called surge capacity. Now, we had a hurricane that almost came to visit yesterday, correct?
Correct.
All right, so let's go back to our example, the family restaurant, right? Organizations can create or develop the 4 planning elements, right, as a unified plan, and each of those are kind of like interlocking pieces of a puzzle, right, that enable continuity. And there's this idea called surge capacity. So the other thing that happens is that most incident response plans and business impact analysis they count on everybody being present, all hands on deck. But let's ask a question. Is there anybody in the class that was here during Hurricane Maria or Irma?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Does anyone remember the governor of the Virgin Islands making a radio announcement that the police were expected to report to work or they'd lose their jobs?
I don't remember that.
Okay. There was a case where the governor got on the radio at night, and because a lot of VIPD, they were affected by the hurricanes themselves, right? So their houses were damaged. Their roof was gone. They had walls missing. They had stuff to deal with at the home front, right? And the government had to function. So after so many days, and this was quite some time after landfall. So after Maria, after Irma, right? The governor got on the radio and said, okay, some of you have been out. We understand this has been bad. But if you don't report for work for your shift tomorrow, we'll be taking action against VIPD who do not report for duty as directed, right? You have to come to work. We have to depend on the availability of VIPD to make this work. And we cannot allow you to stay out any longer. That's called a surge capacity. The number of personnel that you need after a disaster increases, but the problem is the availability of personnel is often less. The availability of resources is often less. So you have to order even more resources, even more food for spoilage. Let's pretend in the hurricane disaster scenario with your family restaurant, if you had half of your food refrigerated or frozen and you lost power and you had no generator because the generator died, how long would that food last?
Couple hours.
Yeah, not very long. So would you order the same amount of food or even more the next time because you had to make up for the lost stuff?
You'd probably overcompensate to back up what you lost.
Oh yeah, you would. You'd have to. That's called the surge, right? The surge capacity. You have to order more supplies. You have to have more resources. You have to have more money. You have to have more people. And if you don't plan on that as a part of your activity, that's where you end up getting screwed. If somebody's hacking your system, you have to keep using your systems in some cases to keep doing your business. That's just the reality of how it works, okay? Any questions so far? Any observations or comments so far?
No, not from me.
So one of the coolest things you can do after you develop these methods and you have them in place is to test them. And what you do is you start an exercise, a mock disaster. Has anybody ever seen a mock disaster? Like for first responders in real life?
Yeah.
Yeah. And isn't it cool when they walk up to people and they're walking through a mock-up of a disaster? And what usually happens is that an authority a person of authority walks up and they go, tag, 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 you're it. You just died. Yeah, that's right. While we're responding to this industrial disaster, there was an explosion and 3 of you just died. Okay. And 4 of you were injured. So now you have to lay down over here, and you 3 over here, you gotta, well, we gotta put a tag on your foot because you're dead. Right? And I know that sounds morbid, but the point is that you have to be able to train and test. Sometimes you find out that there's cross training. Part of your contingency plan is, okay, if the help desk manager is dead, who gets calls for tech support? And we're recovering from a hack and the screens are screwed up, and now the help desk manager is gone. So who do they call? And more importantly, when they call, does that person know what the heck to do? Right? That's one of the coolest things people can do to develop resilience. And it's not just for cybersecurity. It's for all manner of things, right? So this is really rich, very useful information. And it's, to me, it's one of the things that I think is the coolest. What we should do, we should almost do, is rewrite some of the assignments and solutions where you start to finish solving a problem and then spontaneously I, as the instructor, tag in and I'm like, okay, you know what? Your system has just been taken down by a hacker. And now your team has to do the rest, right? So that's something that I think we can start doing in some of our cyber classes, is to sort of gameplay realistic scenarios. Okay, you're trying to solve a problem, you have to write some code, it's to rebuild some systems, tag, you're no longer available, right? So what do you do in that case? And I think for our final module in the course, it'll be a special topics module. And I'm seriously thinking about setting up like a mock disaster. Now, I have a question for all of you. In the final days of our class together, we'll be approaching something called finals exam, right? Final exams. And it's the finals week. And there's usually more pressure, more stuff to do. Do you think as long as there was enough lead time, like say by Thanksgiving, and you knew what to do and how to do, that we could do some kind of mock-up or disaster in a team-oriented scenario? And do you think that some of you could work in teams? I'd like to know your thoughts on that right now. Do you know each other? Have you been in other classes together? Have you had other sessions in our computer science program where you had to work with other students?
Yeah, I have.
Okay. And did that work out okay? Did everybody know what they were supposed to do and everybody had their part and they did it?
Yeah, for the most part, it seemed like it worked out.
For the most part. Okay. So as long as there's structure and there's a what? A contingency. Let's say that for a special topics module at the end of this semester, we come up with a disaster scenario. We have a mock disaster drill, and I include specific contingencies. Do you think you would be willing to consider participating? if it was an option for extra credit?
I I doubt I would do it, especially if it's optional.
Okay,
Honestly, I'm
Well,
not
I
a fan
appre-
of groups like that. That's the thing.
well, I appreciate your candor. So candor is the unique ability to just tell it straight, keep it real, yeah? And I'm very glad that you are candid about your remarks. So, all right, so you're depending on others, it's the end of the semester, it's a crunch time, maybe not, okay? I will send an email to everyone in the class. So not everybody in our class is present right now, but I'll send an email and I'll ask if there are certain scenarios you'd be willing to do independently then. Does anyone else have any other thoughts they'd like to share about this? If there was a well-designed drill and there were fallbacks, and all you had to do was play your role. Okay. All right. Well, let's keep going. So you have different teams of individual that focus on each method, right? So you have an incident response team. That's the IH people. That's dominated by the tech folks with support from the cybersecurity folks, right? The crisis planning or contingency planning team would probably be involved with some aspect of each of these, but the focus areas are different, right? So as we used in our example before, the contingency planning team would probably want to be involved with the incident, with a disaster, and with business continuity, because contingencies basically mean plan A, plan B, plan C, backups, depending on the scenario, right? The incident response team ensures the CSERT is formed. So this acronym is specific, you know. So what we'll do is we'll have a glossary in the addendum, the study guide addendum, that lists these acronyms and what each of these letters mean, and then the definition, okay? Incident classification is the process by which the IR team examines an incident and determines what constitutes an actual incident. So you might have an event and it's a hoax. Has anyone ever received an email that said your bank account was emptied and you have to respond right now? Or
Nope.
that
I haven't, but I know what you're talking about.
has anyone ever received a notice that your data has been used up and it's from an unknown number?
No.
My wife received one last night.
I have.
Yeah. And what they want you to do is to call back, right?
Right there.
So part of the charm of incident handling is knowing when something requires attention and when something can be ignored. So it's triage. The word triage is really important. Has anyone ever heard of the word triage before?
Yeah.
So you check an incident and it's a possible problem, or it's probably an issue, or it's definitely an issue, and then you have degrees of severity. That's what triage is all about. So when an actual incident is in progress, loss of availability of information, loss of the integrity of information, loss of confidentiality, loss of policy, violation of policy or violation of law can occur. That's what our solution is all about. When you think about it, Sidney Corinth did something bad. There was wrongdoing. By the time you read the scenarios, if you have an average person's sensibility about office politics, you're like, okay, there was a salacious love affair in the office, right? And it went sour, it went bad. So now there's hard feelings, right? And so when you look at the circumstances surrounding what's going on, It's like a classic case of disgruntled employee. And those are things that are used in the assessment or analysis of a scenario, right? The context is very important. The context. Digital forensics is the investigation of wrongdoing in the arena of information security. So it requires preservation, identification, extraction, documentation, and interpretation. So those are separate stages of digital forensics once that trigger is pulled. Once an incident handling scenario says, okay, we're either going to fire somebody or they're going to prison. Well, if they fire somebody, we don't want a labor board complaint. And if there was policy violation, we have to be able to prove it. So now we have to preserve the evidence, identify what's in there, extract it, preserve it, document it, and interpret it so that we understand what happened at the root level, what caused it, right? That's what a root cause analysis is. Okay, so a disgruntled employee was frustrated with somebody who is now hurtful in the workplace, and for revenge, you know, there's all of this deleted data or modified data or impersonation, where they're sending nasty emails in the name of someone else, right, to get them in trouble. DR planning encompasses preparation for handling and recovery from a disaster. All right, so we've already covered that. And then business continuity. Now, business continuity can be very sophisticated. You can have a plan to set up work. Let's get back to our simple example. Let's pretend that the small family restaurant had an official building and an official site for the restaurant. And then there's a fire in the kitchen, and the kitchen's destroyed. Does that mean that the restaurant is out of business if the only thing in that building is destroyed is the kitchen? Could the restaurant continue business?
I want to say no, because it's a restaurant and the kitchen is like the main thing that gives you the food. If they have a bar, they can work through that, but
Yes, if they have a bar, that's a start. What if the family residence is right next door? And the kitchen in the family residence is substantial and just a few feet away from the restaurant.
then they could work. They could do fine.
Then they could work, right? So the stove and the appliances, right? The fridge, the freezer, the appliances, all that kind of stuff in the nearby residence could substitute in a pinch with some adaption, right? So one example of that would be like, and we call that a warm site. If we have a hot site, it's a whole nother restaurant with a whole nother kitchen. And all we got to do is forklift the burnt one out and put the new one in. That's a hot site. If you set up shop right next door and it's a brand new building with a brand new kitchen and all you have to do is step across, that's what a hot site is. In terms of data, we're talking about a data center where the data center is up and running and all you have to do is flip a switch and now everybody's getting their files and their email from another system. That's a hot site. A warm site is when you have a suitable facility and it takes some prep. A cold site is, okay, I have the building and I have the access and I can set it up if I need to by mutual agreement. That's what a cold site is. Does everybody understand the distinction between hot, warm, and cold?
Yeah.
So because the disaster recovery and business continuity plans are closely related, most organizations prepare both of them at the same time and may combine them into a single planning document called the business resumption plan. Now there's another phrase, and I'll probably put this in a revision of the addendum. The gauche term, the popular term that's in use right now the latest phrase is called enterprise continuity planning, ECP, enterprise continuity planning. So a lot of times you'll see an organization talk about their enterprise continuity plan. That's how they're going to resume their business and recover from disaster. It's kind of like an all-inclusive, sort of a big umbrella, means all of these things together. And what's happening is that across the industry, references to BCP are changing so that people are just calling it ECP, enterprise continuity planning, instead of business continuity. So continuity means resumption, right? You'll see different combinations, and there's no one set way to do it. That's the important thing to remember. The disaster plan should include crisis management. So if it's truly a disaster, that's a crisis. That includes components of crisis management, right? That's just common sense. If you have a crisis and it's serious, you have to deal with it. That's part of the disaster recovery plan, because, I mean, and the simple truth is, you know, how do you get insurance money? How do you rebuild? What do you do in the meantime so that people can pay their bills, right? Those are all elements of a worst case scenario or a disaster. You have to simulate, you have to have structured walkthroughs. You have something called a tabletop exercise or a desk check. You'll see references that talk about a desk check or tabletop exercise. And that's different than a structured walkthrough. So a desk check or a tabletop exercise is when people are all in one room and they walk through the plan, but they're not really actually doing it. And then the structured walkthrough is when people get up out of the room and they walk over to the data center and they turn off the power and they see whether or not the generator cuts on. So a walkthrough is more specific, and you'd say, okay, this is where I walk over to the generator and I'd pull the generator into play here. Let's check the fuel. Do we have fuel? What's our fuel reserve? Wait a minute, why is the fuel tank? Oh, we had to run when they had the, what are they calling them, shutdowns? What is WAPA doing now? Rolling blackouts? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, the rolling blackouts. Because of the rolling blackouts, we only have half a tank. So in the structured walkthrough, you'd walk through these things and you'd make like you're going to do it. In the simulation, right, you're actually doing some of those things. And in the full interruption, in every case, you can act like and produce conditions that are like the real thing, you're doing it. So there's different levels of practicing. The $64,000 question is whether or not you actually do it, right? You actually take the time. And I got to tell you a story, and this is really important because I want you to know about a guy named Resorla. Has anyone ever heard of the World Trade Center?
Yeah.
Oh, it's Rick Rescorla. My bad. Rick Rescorla. Okay. So what do we know about the World Trade Center?
It was attacked.
It was attacked during 9/11, right? So you see September 11th, right? And Rick Rescorla was, well, he was a guy that worked for Merrill Lynch, or I'm sorry, Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley at the World Trade Center. And here's what happened. Many years before, there was a truck bombing in the parking garage in the basement of the Trade Center. So Rick Rescorla had just been assigned as the disaster recovery specialist for Morgan Stanley, right, at the World Trade Center in New York City. And as soon as he started, not long afterwards, this was years before, in the 1990s, there was a terrorist attack where a truck bomb was detonated in the parking garage in the basement of the World Trade Center. And what he did was he studied this. So he's former military, right? And he looked at his adversary and he realized they're coming back. This is not over. We dodged this. We didn't, the building didn't come down, but the people who want to end this enterprise, they're coming back. He knew that something else was going to happen. So he took the time to practice evacuations of the building, right? So, this is just an homage to him, right? So he was a very serious person who worked with the military, the US Army MPs, military police, and he had served with distinction, right? So he received the Silver Star in the Vietnam War and the Bronze Star with an oak leaf cluster, which means that if he got an oak leaf cluster, that means he was twice awarded. So every oak leaf cluster is an additional award. So if it's 2 oak leaf clusters, that would be 3 Bronze Stars. So he's received a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart. He was wounded, right? So this was a guy who really knew his stuff. And he took his corporate security job seriously. Now, make no mistake, cybersecurity begins with physical security. And so he watched when terrorists started taking down airlines. There was a bombing on an aircraft. It was a Pan Am flight. Now, Pan American doesn't exist anymore. They went out of business. So a few bad things can happen to a company and it can cause them to go out of business. So Pan Am was bought by another airline, but Pan American Airlines, I think, was, well, you can look that up. But in any case, he started seeing about how terrorist attacks were happening. And then in the basement, right? It had to do with 1993. In 1993, the truck bomb went off and he figured out, wait a minute, they figured out a way to make these explosives work really well. And they used something called ANFO, anhydrous fuel, oil, and fertilizer and oil, right? Anhydrous fertilizer and oil, ANFO. Now, I'm telling you this because if you pay attention to the details in our module solution, you're going to see a reference to this again, right? So if you take fertilizer of a certain grade, and then you take fuel oil and you mix it together, and you set it up in a certain manner, and you trigger it, it'll explode like dynamite or C4, right? And this is what happened in 1993. And he realized, because of the intelligence behind there, that his organization was at risk. So he would routinely pull people out of their offices to do the drills. And the thing that I wanted you to understand is that the World Trade Center was one of the world's tallest buildings, right? So it was over 100 stories high. And he spent, he would just call drills at different times, and he'd say, okay, now it's time to go ahead. And essentially, he was credited with saving over 1,000 lives. So to make a long story short, because he required everyone to do the drills, the walkthroughs, the disaster scenarios, right? And he made people practice more than once a year. They had to leave the building. They had to stop what they were doing. They had to exit as fast as possible. When the flight hit 9/11, more than 1,000 people in his company alone were saved, right? Actually, I take that back. More than 2,700 employees, right? So he kept going back into the building, kept going back into the building. He wanted to make sure everybody was out. And the last time he went in, that's when the building came down. And so he was martyred. He was killed by that. I got mixed up with my numbers. I was thinking of another scenario where there was about 1,000 people. In any case, the thing I want you to understand is that he put to practice the things that mattered the most. And at the end of the day, if you have a cybersecurity program and you're planning for the worst, if you don't take the time to plan with others in a desktop scenario, right? So you do a desktop drill, and then you walk through it, and then you simulate it, and then you initiate conditions as close to reality as possible, so there's full interruption. You gain insights whenever you do this, and you start to realize what you need in order to be able to continue operating. And it's not rocket science. It bites you in the nose. One of the things that happened over and over again with Rick Riscorla is he figured out in his variety of drills the things that people needed to do to get out faster, because he knew, because of the compromise to the atmosphere, when there's a detonation and an explosion, the breathable air is gone very, very quickly. So people have to get clear of the area within seconds, right? So that's the thing that credited him with such amazing success. Okay. Are there any questions before we clear for the day? I think on that note, what we'll do is we'll stop here. This is the last part of the summary for the chapter 5 content. And please be sure to read the additional detail in the study guide, the related detail in the study guide. All right, we'll take up the rest in the next chapter on Wednesday. And I hope to hear from you by email when you can get on our mock-up, our system, right? Our simulated office machine.